In June of 2026, a pilot climbed into the cockpit of America's newest bomber, and for the first time in the history of modern flight testing, he wasn't there to test the aircraft. He was there to test whether it could fight. His name hasn't been released. His job title has. Operational Test Pilot, Detachment 5, Air Force Operational Test and Evaluation Center. Sitting next to him, a developmental test pilot from the 420th Flight Test Squadron. Two very different jobs, crammed into one cockpit, years earlier than anyone expected them to be. Every stealth bomber the Air Force has ever built follows the same script. First, you prove it can fly. Then, months or years later, once the engineers sign off, you bring in the people who'll actually fly it in combat and ask whether it can fight. The B-21 Raider broke that sequence. And the reason it broke that sequence tells you almost everything you need to know about how worried the Pentagon actually is. To understand why the Air Force is in this much of a hurry, you have to go back to a room in Palmdale, California on December 2nd, 2022. That's the day the B-21 was unveiled to the public. A flying wing, low and dark, that looked like a slightly smaller cousin of the B-2 Spirit it was designed to replace. 6 test aircraft were already under construction on that same production line, built by the same technicians who'd eventually build the operational fleet. Northrop Grumman had spent more than $5 billion on digital engineering tools and manufacturing systems just to get to that unveiling. The program itself traces back to 2011, when the Air Force quietly launched what it called the Long Range Strike Bomber Effort, a classified project to build the aircraft that would eventually retire both the B-2 and the aging B-1 Lancer. 11 months after that unveiling, the aircraft flew. November 10th, 2023, just before 7 in the morning, lifting off from Air Force Plant 42. A photojournalist named Matt Hartman caught it on camera from a public road because most of what happens to this aircraft still isn't something the Air Force chooses to show you. That's the baseline, a bomber that flew for the first time in late 2023. But by early 2026, something had changed, and it wasn't the aircraft, it was the schedule. On February 23, 2026, the Department of the Air Force and Northrop Grumman agreed to redirect $4.5 billion in funding the program already had, specifically to increase B-21 production capacity by 25%. Not new money from Congress. Existing money reshuffled to build the aircraft faster. 2 months later, in April, the Air Force released footage of a B-21 taking on fuel from a KC-135 tanker mid-flight, a milestone that has nothing to do with basic airworthiness and everything to do with how far this bomber can reach without landing. Then came the number that made test engineers pay attention. In May 2026, the Air Force confirmed the B-21 had completed a flight test campaign originally scheduled to run 180 days. It finished in 73, less than half the planned time on a program tied to $11.8 billion in contract value. Former test personnel who reviewed the announcement pointed to the most likely explanation: fewer software rewrites, less downtime between flights, telemetry that held up, sortie after sortie, instead of forcing engineers back to the drawing board. That's not normal for a first-of-its-kind stealth aircraft. The B-2 program, 3 decades earlier, spent years working through exactly the kind of software and integration problems the B-21 appears to be skipping. So the aircraft was flying faster than scheduled and being built faster than funded. But speed on paper doesn't answer the only question that actually matters for a bomber. Can someone fly it into a fight and bring it home? That's what changed in June. On June 11, 2026, the 412th Test Wing at Edwards Air Force Base announced that an operational test pilot had flown the B-21 alongside a developmental test pilot, the first time in the aircraft's history that both had shared a cockpit. Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Gray, who commands the 420th Flight Test Squadron and directs the Raider Combined Test Force, put it plainly. Bringing operational testers in this early means the Air Force can evaluate the bomber's combat utility, not just whether it can safely take off and land. Colonel Matt Guasco, who commands the Operational Test Detachment, went further. In the history of modern test, he said, the Air Force has never folded operational evaluation into a program this early. The flight was made possible by a second B-21 test aircraft that arrived at Edwards in the fall of 2025, giving the combined test force enough airframes to run mission systems and weapons integration work alongside the ongoing flight performance testing. That's the practical reason two very different kinds of pilots were suddenly in the same jet. It's also why, days before that flight, Air Force General Dale White stood in front of the Raider Combined Test Force and called the accelerated schedule proof of the acquisition culture the service is trying to build across every program it runs. Here's what operational testing is actually built to expose, and it's not glamorous. Can maintainers keep this aircraft flying in the field, not just in a hangar in the Mojave Desert? Do the mission systems actually support the tasks a combat crew needs to do under pressure? Can weapons be employed the way the aircraft was designed to employ them? Those are the questions that, in most bomber programs, don't get asked until years after first flight, because asking them too early on an unfinished aircraft used to mean redesigning things twice. The Air Force is choosing to find out now, while production is still ramping up, on the theory that an expensive fix today is cheaper than the same fix after the assembly line is running at full speed. And the assembly line is the other half of this story. The Air Force's minimum order is at least 100 aircraft, at a target average cost of $692 million each in 2022 dollars. The first of them is scheduled to reach Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota in 2027, with Whiteman and Dyess Air Force bases to follow. There are currently 18 B-2 Spirits left in the entire Air Force inventory. The B-1 fleet is decades old and was never built with stealth in mind to begin with. The B-52, the plane both of them are meant to eventually retire alongside, has no low observable capability against modern integrated air defenses at all. Senior Air Force officials have also pointed out that the B-21 burns a fraction of the fuel legacy bombers do, which matters enormously in a Pacific scenario where tankers themselves would be operating under missile threat at extreme range, trying to refuel fighters, bombers, and reconnaissance aircraft at the same time. That's the shape of the urgency, not a single crisis, but a fleet quietly running out of runway against adversaries who have spent the last decade building air defenses specifically designed to find aircraft like the B-2. Much of what the B-21 can actually do to answer that threat is still classified and will likely stay that way for years. What isn't classified is the pattern, a test campaign that finished at less than half its scheduled length, a production budget redirected to build faster, and now, a combat pilot in the cockpit years before anyone expected to see one there. None of that proves the aircraft works exactly as designed. It proves the Air Force has stopped waiting to find out. The last B-2 flew for the first time in 1989 during the Cold War against a threat that no longer exists in the same form. The B-21 is being tested against the threat that replaced it, and the people running this program have made a decision that hasn't been made this early in any bomber program in modern history. Find out now whether it can fight while there's still time to fix what doesn't work. Whether that bet pays off won't be answered by another test flight. It'll be answered the first time a B-21 has to do this for real.